Want to know, can't you hear, won't you see? Gene here, alive and in living color right here on the YouTube and scattered throughout the rest of the internet as shorts and reels and Instagrams, etc. And I'm excited to welcome you to Gene Has Concerns, ... Expedition Unknown Hell Ship Part 2. I just finished the episode a little while ago and really enjoyed this episode. And definitely want to welcome you back. Thanks for tuning in again. And again, this is part 2 of discussion. You go back and look last week's. This is the new improved version 2 because I have better notes. So anyway, this show is not necessarily a review show. This is more of a companion chat for Expedition Unknown. The goal is to highlight interesting moments, history, behind the scenes details if I can, updates hopefully, and any concerns or observations that I have, especially the concerns. That's why it's called Gene Has Concerns. So, and this episode kind of deserves a little bit more serious tone because of the 1,000+ POWs who never came home that are involved with the 2 ships discussed. And definitely stick around at the end because I did a little bit of additional research after watching the episode and found a couple of updates that may interest you. And I'll be discussing those more as we wrap up. Now, the DPAA recovery mission. The DPAA is the Defense POW Accounting Agency, and they returned to, forgive me, Oryoku, Maru wreck. And this was in last week's episode, this was the second ship that they dove on. And the mission there is to recover the remains, identify POWs, and the identifications can include what I've learned is DNA, dental records, anthropology research, historical research, and military records. And of course, they want to try to return remains to the families. So, and they do this with an incredible amount of care. Every bucket that they touch, they're meticulously going over in the sifters, and just really, they just take, like I said, reverent care over this, and nobody's rushed in doing anything. So now inside the wreck is last week we saw the hatch discovered, and the visibility is very, very poor down there. And you'll see in this episode it's a little bit worse. And it's very dangerous down there because you got jagged edges, especially with these divers that are going down, the hard hat divers with the umbilical cord, is that could get snagged on something and ripped open or whatever. And that's their lifeline going back up. So, and they attempted to recover bodies back in World War II, and it ended up an explosion that happened, and they had to stop their recovery. It was a pressure breach, they called it. And it was not simply just an air pocket like I was thinking. Get a little bit of digging, and when divers breach sealed compartments, trap gases and pressure changes create an explosion. That was the hazard. And combined with decades of trapped fuel residues and unstable conditions, and even live ordnances that could still be down there that could explode and whatnot. So they had to be very, very careful going back down this time. And they do things a lot differently than they would have back 80 years ago. But imagine being one of those divers and you're essentially entering a floating tomb. And that's just kind of nuts. And you notice Josh Gates, he never over dramatizes things in this nature. There are sometimes he does, but that's for comedic effect. But here, he just kind of lets the wreck speak for itself. So, and then the hard hat divers. Last week Josh revealed that his father was a hard hat diver. And, they're supplied with oxygen from the surface through the umbilical cord. And they have long-term dives that they stay down for. And with that, they have to go to the decompression chamber and stay there for an hour or however long is needed to get balance again and get the nitrogen, I think they said, out of their blood. Someone comment on that if that's the case. And then it's definitely extremely specialized diving, and it's not something just the recreational divers go out and do. So, and then they have the recovery basket, and you notice in this episode they're using basically a giant vacuum to suck up all the debris and sand and shells and bones, the remains and everything up into a basket. And then they lift this up to the surface, and they attach they deploy this buoy. I think it's got a different name to it, but lift bags basically, and they float this basket over to the other ship, the barge, where they're actually going to do the recovery process. And I wonder, when they manually move it, they float it. Josh was there. I give him kudos for diving in and helping move this basket over to the barge. But it's, I wonder why they don't have a mechanical pulley system instead of moving manually. They have a rope attached to it. This is connected to the barge at men are pulling. But I'm surprised that they don't have a mechanical system. But maybe it's for simplicity. Less equipment to have to deal with, fewer failure points possibly, or even, just easier deployment all around. So, and, Josh could have stood there and just watched, but he's in there, moving this. So, and then here's where we get to kind of the amazing part is they're dealing with hundreds of buckets of debris, and they're tiny fragments. You can see these little tiny shells, and they come across the bones, and everybody again is just being respectful and showing reverence to everything, and nothing gets ignored. And if you notice in the episode, the DPAA intentionally blurs the possible remains, and two of those reasons I found out was respect for the families, of course, but also to avoid misidentification. Because what if they were to find something? You'll see later, a pair of glasses. What if there was those glasses that was recognizable as some family? Well, they did show the glasses, so I don't know if that would work actually. So, but there's something to do with misidentification that I learned in doing a little bit of research after watching. So they didn't blur the glasses actually, which I can't go with that after all. But imagine in the future with AI and AI imagery, that they may be able to put a camera above the sifter and take a picture, and AI immediately identifies certain things that maybe the human eye might miss, buttons or other artifacts or medical equipment, stuff like that. So, and then lastly about the debris, if you notice, they dumped the debris down below. They just turned the sifters over down below. It looks like it was being caught in a tarp area or something. And I wonder if they just dump that back in the ocean, or do they further look through those materials beforehand in case anything was missed? So that's something that I would like to learn more about. And then look at what they found. I mentioned the eyeglasses already. That that was someone wore. They found that medical needle that was used, possibly may not have been used, but it was there to be used. And they found all those hundreds of chopsticks. I think may have said thousands of chopsticks. And, they looked like they were in soggy, but still good condition. Josh was holding a pair and everything. But, going back to these glasses, someone wore those. It didn't matter if they were Japanese or American. That was a human being who wore those. And maybe they were one of the lucky ones that got away, that escaped. And, just lost their glasses, but then again, it could have been one of the casualties there, one of the ones that died. And then that bone fragment, like I said, they did blur that bone fragment, but it was just interesting that how reverent, I keep going back to that, and I hate to repeat myself, how reverent they are with stuff like that. And then they go, and I was surprised to find out that even after 80 years underwater, under seawater, they can try to do the DNA research to see if they can match that to a family member. And the DNA all depends on the preservation, the contamination, and remaining collagen inside the bone. And, I did a little research and found that salt water does make recovery harder in identifying, but it doesn't automatically destroy the DNA. So there is still a chance that they can match DNA. And now with this, I still want to do further research on other ways they may identify remains, and exactly how they treat everything, how they do they have actual funerals, and do the it's not honor guard, I forget what it's called. So again, someone in the comments tell me what this is. But they do the 21 gun salute. Do they do that for each individual, or do they, after the recovery's all done, hold a ceremony and invite all the family members and do something like that? So, but then also they found that part of that boot that someone wore, and that was a U.S. soldier that wore that. It was stamped with USA on the inside, and even had the last name carved on it. And they blurred out the name also, again, for misidentification. One of it was Smith, and who knows how many Smiths may be POWs in the Pacific arena. So, they do that. But, the POWs, they carved their names in the boots, and that hit me pretty hard, and they want to identify themselves. And actually, on a side note, with identifying themselves, nowadays, I realized by watching season 10 of MasterChef the other day that one of the contestants, Sarah, they showed her in her fatigues, and she had a black patch right here in the middle of her chest that said "O neg." So look at where they were back then, look where they are today, that they're wearing their blood type right on their chest, which is pretty cool. So, but I did a little bit more research on the practice of writing their name, and it's a common military practice. It was established by the time World War II was happening. After World War I, where service members marked personal clothing and gear, it was recommended by the military to do this. And then official military regulations often specify marking in their boots. In this case, the name found inside the boot could be an important clue to the investigators. But it could still need to be confirmed using military records, historical documentation, for instance, evidence, before making an identification. And then you also have to figure that, another aspect of this is, again, this could be someone that actually escaped and didn't die in this shipwreck. So, they got to do that also, because they might be able to match this to a man who lived after World War II and lived a long life. So that's something else they need to look into. Now we move on to the Oryoku Maru, and this was a totally different mission. This is British and Dutch POWs, up to 1,000 of them that died in this shipwreck. And again, this one was bombed by the U.S. fighter. And the depth in this one is about 160 feet down, so it's a much harder dive to get down there and more difficult. You got to love Josh can still sneak in a little bit of humor here and there. And when they were doing the little ROV, the rover, using an Xbox controller. And what's funny is, modern military, scientific, commercial, and even private equipment operators for drones and ROVs, stuff like this, they're using these gaming controllers. They've become much more common because they're inexpensive, reliable, and operators already are familiar with using them. So, and then we have the this is going to be difficult. Photogrammetry. Goodness. And for this episode, they took 20,000 photos. It builds a three-dimensional model where they join all the photos together. I'm hearing they didn't specifically say this here, but I'm hearing that they use AI for stuff like that. And it gives the measurements also. It's able to tell, if there's a big hole, like the holding hole in the top of the ship, the distance from one edge to the other. And matching that to the schematics, I thought was really cool. And everything matched, within just a, point whatever of feet or inches and stuff like that. And one measurement after another kept matching. So this was just great detective work. And this may have been my favorite part of the episode, is watching these guys use engineering and technology to solve this 80-year-old mystery of what this ship is. So, excuse me, got a spot on my glasses. And then go back to the human remains. They're finding just little tiny bone fragments, and they have to bag those and mark those and tag them and send them off to research. And the wreck is now, both these wrecks are now unquestionably a grave. And I want to do more research as to what the Memorial Foundation does afterwards. How do they do the recovery, or do the governments of the Netherlands and England, do they do the recovery, or do they even do any type of recovery except for what was laying out on top of the ocean floor and on top of the ship, due to the depth of it? But I'm sure they preserve the wreck, they educate the public, and ensure governments recognize and protect the site. So, and as I said last week, I'd love to see about interviewing some of these people that were involved in this episode, from the DPAA, Megan Mumford, the underwater archaeologist, and Matt DeFelice, the forensic anthropologist, and then also the project recovery there, of the divers. Maybe I can get one of them, or the historians. Maybe I can get one of them to possibly do an interview, a follow-up episode with me, as well as with the foundation, the Hellship Memorial Foundation, and maybe I can secure an interview and do a bonus episode with that. So now I do have those couple of updates we mentioned, and I definitely want to talk about here. And that is that the DPAA officially announced in February 2026 that the underwater recovery mission of it's like Oryoku, I guess that's how you say it, Oryoku Maru, is one of the largest and most complex underwater recovery operations it has ever undertaken. They emphasize that it's a multi-year mission, so the work viewers saw in the episode was only the beginning of it. So that might be, worth a follow-up investigation or a follow-up show, next year, to wrap back around to see what other updates they have. And then the second update I have is potential future episode for maybe Josh Gates, if not for myself, is the Enoura Maru with the foundation, the Hellship Foundation, is trying to, I'm sorry, I'm misstating this, is besides that, they've also have said that there's two other ships that they're working on, which is the well, it says in my notes say Enoura Maru again, so maybe I made a mistake there on my notes, but the Brazil Maru also. So there's two other ships that I think they're working on also. And DPAA is actively identifying casualties like we said. And that's actually something that Josh could revisit. But again, wrapping back around to what I said is maybe I can secure some interviews with some of these people and get current updates and see what else they might be doing in the future with these other vessels. Excuse me. And then I also want to do some more research to see if the DPAA assists in other allied nations' recoveries. Maybe go to a deeper dive of the identification, which I said earlier. And then see if Britain, here we go, see if Britain and Netherlands mount a recovery of the Oryoku Maru. So that was the first ship I was trying to say earlier, and just the last piece mentioned the Brazil Maru. And are both these ships, or are these ships all now legally protected? Now they've been identified and discovered and such. And what happens to all the sifted material afterwards? I think I could still do some research on that again. And any updates since filming I mentioned. And then from there, just keep in mind, this wasn't a treasure hunt. This wasn't a great grand adventure for television. This was history, and this was remembrance, and it was keeping a promise made 80 years ago, and they tried to do this before with the one ship. And, you know, we got to go back to what we've always heard for so long is no one left behind. That's what it looks like they're trying to do. And that line carries a lot more weight after watching these two episodes. So, but until next week, I don't know what next week's episode is going to be about yet for Josh. I didn't go and look to see what the upcoming episode is. I didn't see a preview. I kind of don't like seeing previews anymore because they spoil things for me. But I'll be back next week with episode 3 of season 17 with Josh Gates to kind of talk about more about stuff. And, you know, please give me comments. Give me some ideas on what you think I may be able to follow up of, or give me some pointers if you think there's something I need to be, you know, doing or not doing during these things. And I really want these to become companion pieces because I do have concerns. My concerns may not be bad. They might be inquisitive. They might be good. They might be bad. I may have to sit there and say, what in the blue hell are these people doing? I don't know. But anyway, you take care. You have fun. You have a great rest of your week. And just always remember, Gene has concerns.